Title: He sent the woman out of the war briefing, then the SecDef refused to start without her URL, https://YouTube. Comhash, VHVUG3SG65OK. Leave the placard. She'll want the same seat tomorrow. Command Sergeant Major Arlen Boone said it without looking up. He was squaring chairs in an emptied war room at 2100 hours. The way a man squares chairs when the day behind him has rearranged something sung inside his chest. Captain Lena Brooks. Bay stood at the head of the long table with a name placard in her hand and did not put it down. The placard was white letters on blue machine, printed that afternoon, and it read, Brigadier General A. Voss. Brooks looked at it the way people look at a photograph of a storm they stood inside of. Sergeant Major, she said. Did you know? Boone pushed the last chair flush against the table. 34 years in uniform had taught him the exact weight of a chair and the exact weight of a question. I knew on Tuesday, he said. I just didn't know what I knew. To understand what a placard was doing at the head of that table and why a colonel 3 doors down was sitting alone in an office with the lights off. The clock has to run backward. 2 days 0640, Tuesday morning, July 13th, 2026. The heat came off the concrete and sheets. A woman came through the headquarters entrance of the Joint Task Force in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been issued rather than bought. She carried one bag, and the bag was sterile. No airline tags, no lanyards, no coffee-stained paperback wedged in the outside pocket. At the visitor control desk, she presented credentials from the office of the Secretary of Defense, and the desk sergeant typed her into the system the way he typed in every Washington suit. OSD staff, escort not required. Floor 3. If he had looked at her for 4 more seconds, the heat came off the concrete sheets, he might have noticed that she clipped the visitor badge with the face turned inward toward her jacket so that her name wrote against the fabric where nobody could read it. He did not look for 4 more seconds. Nobody in the building did. That was the point of the suit. The headquarters itself was 11 years old and built to outlast opinion. 3 floors of poured concrete, a secure core, and a briefing floor engineered for exactly the week it was now having. 240 people worked the building on a normal day. This week, it held over 300, and every one of them had a lane, a badge, and a theory about everyone else's. A Joint Task Force, 4 dies, out from a Secretary of Defense decision brief is less a military organization than a pressurized instrument, and instruments under pressure read every input except the quiet ones. Her name was Adrienne Voss. She was 47 years old, and for the next 2 days the building would know her as a strategy analyst, because that is what the compartment demanded, and because she had learned over 25 years that a plan travels safest inside a person. Nobody photographs. Floor 3 was a weather system. The Joint Task Force was 4 days from the Joint Task Force, 4 days from the most consequential decision brief the command had ever hosted, and the secure briefing floor had the pressure of it. Staff officers moving in fast pairs, a printer running like small arms fire, placards going down a 40-ft table in 2 even rows. At the center of the weather stood a colonel with silver at his temples and a voice built for large rooms. Victor Hose, 52, Chief of Plans. He spoke in paragraphs, and the paragraphs had subheadings, and the subheadings all resolved to the same theme. This floor is mine. The war room answered to him. The way weather answers to a front. He had built the brief structure, chaired the boards, and, personally, assigned the 40 seats at the long table twice, moving 2 colonels like chess castles, for reasons he explained to no one. 29 years of service had refined in Victor Hose a single conviction, load-bearing as any annex. came off the concrete in sheets, that a room runs on the certainty of the man at the front of it, and that certainty maintained at sufficient volume is indistinguishable from being right. Voss took a seat at the long table. Second chair from the far end. She set a green notebook on the table and squared it to the edge, corner to corner, a half-second adjustment most people would never register. Then she looked at the wall clock, which read 0715, and something in her settled, as if the clock had confirmed a private schedule. Brooks noticed her first, a J-35 action officer, 29 years old, carrying a stack of red head binders with her chin. She noticed because the woman at the table sat like nobody else in the building sat, not stiff, balanced, both feet flat, spine easy, hands still. The stillness of a person who has spent a great many hours in rooms where movement had a cost. Hose noticed her 11 minutes later. He came down the length of the table, trailing two majors and a slide deck, saw the charcoal suit in the second chair, and stopped the way a man stops when he finds furniture out of place in his own home. His eyes went to the visitor badge, turned inward, unreadable, then to the green notebook, then to her face, which gave him nothing at all. "I think you're confused, sweetie. This table is for principals. Somebody walk her out." He said it at conversational volume, which on that floor was a form of broadcasting. 40 people heard it. The printer kept firing. A young specialist appeared at Voss's elbow, ears red, and gestured toward the glass-walled ante-room off the main floor, with an apology that had no words in it. Voss closed the green notebook. She stood without hurry, tucked the notebook under her arm, and read the specialist's name tape once. "Thank you, Specialist Greer," she said. And her voice was level and unbothered, the voice of a woman confirming a reservation. She walked to the ante-room at an even pace. She did not look back at the colonel. The colonel had already stopped looking at her. Through the ante-room's glass wall, Adrient watched Victor Hose lower himself into the chair at the head of the table, the briefer's chair, and begin to rehearse, gesturing at a slide she could not hear. The wall clock reached 0720 exactly, and she checked it, and it was 5 minutes to the second since the last time she had checked it. She opened concrete in sheets. She opened the notebook and wrote one line in small closed handwriting, and underlined nothing because, in 25 years, she had never once needed to underline anything to remember that it mattered. The wall gave way on Wednesday mid-morning, and it gave way in public. The air refueling synchronization matrix would not close. 4 tankers. CAC. 2 orbits, a strike package with legs 1,100 nautical miles long, and somewhere inside the arithmetic, a hole that swallowed 20 minutes of fuel. The J4 planners ran it 3 times. They ran it a 4th time, with fresh eyes and a fresh pot of coffee, and the 20 minutes stayed missing. A strike package is arithmetic wearing a uniform. Offload rates, orbit timing, headwinds, divert margins, every number holding hands with the next one. When lies, they all lie, and the planners had spent 2 hours interrogating honest numbers. The wall display showed the divert airfield, sitting fat and comfortable inside the safety margin, and the fuel numbers said otherwise, and nobody could make the two agree. Hose handled it the way he handled everything, by widening the blast radius. "This is a logistics product," he announced to the room. "If J4 can't make gas math work, I need to hear it, before the Secretary of Defense does, not after." A lieutenant colonel from logistics turned a slow shade of brick. The anteroom door stood open. From it, a level voice crossed the floor and cut the argument off at the angles. "Your divert field is 11 minutes outside the fuel window, not 4. Check the winds off table you loaded. It is March. You want July. Silence has textures. This one lasts a concrete ins. 3 seconds, and had the texture of 40 people deciding whether something was worth turning around for. A major at the fuel station turned first, not because he believed her, but because checking cost nothing. He pulled the source table, scrolled to the header, and stopped. Telzables dated March, he said to nobody in particular. In the voice of a man reading his own autopsy. Seasonal winds. We loaded the wrong quarter. He rebuilt the cell with July winds aloft. The hole in the arithmetic closed like water over a stone. 11 minutes, exactly. As the woman in the anteroom had said, standing 20 feet away, reading a wall display at an angle, upside down to half the data, without a calculator, without sitting down. Command. Sergeant Major Arlen Boone was standing at the back wall with a coffee he had stopped drinking. He had spent the concrete in sheets. He had spent 34 years watching people be competent in front of him, and he had a sense for the shape of it, the way harbor pilots have a sense for draft. Analysts, it's Red Summers. Analysts asked for the threat picture in the front of the book. He watched the woman walk back to her chair in the anteroom, even pace, heel to toe, and at the corridor turned, she checked the wall concrete and sheets, and he checked his watch, and it was 5 minutes to the second since she had checked it last. Analysts don't read Winseloff tables, he said quietly. Brooks, passing with binders, followed his eyes. Sir, nothing, Captain. But he kept looking. On the main floor, H absorbed the correction, the way a certain kind of officer absorbs any event by metabolizing it into his own performance. Within the hour, he had re-briefed the corrected synchronization to the operations group as a J5 catch. My shop ran the seasonal tables to ground, was the phrasing, and the room nodded, and the credit settled over him like snow. Boone watched that too. He had seen credit migrate uphill his whole career. Every headquarters has gravity. What interested him was the anteroom's response, which was nothing. No cough, no raised eyebrow at the glass. The woman had watched her own catch get harvested at 40 feet and had written one line in a green notebook. The heat came off the concrete in sheets, and Boone found himself thinking of an old master gunner he had served under, who used to say that the most dangerous person on any range is the one keeping score silently. In the anteroom, Voss wrote the time in the green notebook. It was Brooks who cracked first in the small human way that matters later. Whew. She carried a coffee into the anteroom at 1300 black, because the woman did not strike her as a cream and sugar variable, and set it down with an apology for the seating. The floor's tight this week, ma'am. It isn't personal. It never is, Voss said, and there was no edge on it at all, which somehow made it worse. Brooks lingered. 2 days of watching this woman get Founder furniture had begun to itch somewhere behind her sternum. Can I ask? You're on the Access roster, aren't you? I validated it Tuesday. I could have sworn your name. She stopped, because saying I could have sworn out loud is the moment a staff officer hears her own doubt for the first time. It was there Tuesday, Voss said. She turned the coffee cup a quarter turn, aligning the seam of the paper with the table edge. You did your job, Captain. The roster did not stay done. She said it, without weight, the way she said everything, and went back to her notebook. And Brooks walked out with the distinct sensation of having been handed a thread with something heavy on the far end. Boone watched the captain come off the anteroom like a swimmer coming off a drop-off, and said nothing, and added it to the file he was not officially keeping. By Thursday morning, the floor had found its name for her. The note-taker, a major from J3, said in the coffee mess, not bothering to lower his voice, is still out there 2 days. What does she even write? His partner laughed into the creamer. Billing codes, he said. Washington bills by the 6-minute increment, like lawyers. It was the kind of laughter that costs nothing at the time and compounds later at ruinous interest. By Thursday, the climate had a paperwork layer. Her seat at Tuesday's table had been backfilled by a liaison officer. Nobody remembered inviting. The morning intelligence summary, distributed to 41 inboxes, went to 40. Came off the concrete and sheets. When she used the visitor phone to reach the operations floor, the calls rolled to a voicemail box that had never been set up. None of it was an order. All of it was policy. That is how institutions do their bullying. No fingerprints. All consensus. Everyone downstream of a tone that one man set at conversational volume on a Tuesday morning. Condescension in an institution rarely arrives as one act. It arrives as a climate. The escort who no longer made eye contact, the Dro clerk who walked the read-ahead binders, past the anti-room's glass wall. 40 binders. 40 binders on a cart, one for every principal in strap hanger without slowing. The seat at the table that had become in 72 hours structurally impossible. As if the chair itself had been reclassified. Brooks pulled the Access roster history. Because the itch behind her sternum had gotten worse. What she found took her 4 minutes and aged her 4 years. Adrian Voss, OSD Access, granted Tuesday 0611, and below it, entry deleted. Wednesday 22111. No annotation, no authority cited. Deletions were supposed to carry a reason code the way rounds carry lot numbers. She took it to Haas, because the chain of command is the chain of command, and because part of her still believed the deletion was a glitch that a colonel would want fixed. He was standing at the head of the war room with the timeline board behind him. She showed him the printout. He read it for less time than it deserved and handed it back. Captain, the roster is groomed by people above your pay grade. Brief your lane. Sir, there's no reason code on the your lane. Captain. He said it, pleasantly, in front of the entire job, which was the point. Public correction is a leash that fits everyone watching. Not just the neck, it goes around. Brooks took the printout back to her desk and did not throw it away. And that small failure to obey the spirit of the order would end up mattering a great deal. Sheet. In the anteroom, Voss submitted a written request for the read ahead through the visitor liaison channel, citing the correct form number, the correct routing office, and the correct regulation paragraph, and sub-E paragraph in language so procedurally exact that the liaison sergeant read it twice, just to admire the construction. The request came back, denied in 90 minutes. Principals only. She logged the time of submission and the time of denial in the green notebook, 1 line each. At the end of the day, Hose passed the anteroom on his way out. He was feeling expansive. The murder board had gone well. The timeline was his. The floor was his. He rapped a knuckle on the glass twice the way a man taps an aquarium. Still here, sweetheart. Washington bills by the hour. Voss looked up from the notebook and gave him exactly 1 second of eye contact. Not anger, not hurt. A level second end of appraisal. The kind of look surveyors give a slope before they write the grade, and went back to writing. Hose walked on with his majors, already retelling it. Here is what the room could not see, and what the note-taker's notebook now held in small closed handwriting. A deleted roster entry, time-stamped. A stolen correction, time-stamped. A denied request, cited to regulation. A pattern assembling itself with the patience of sediment. If you have ever been written off by a room that never asked your name, the heat came off the concrete in sheets. If you have ever watched credit for your work settle on someone else's shoulders like snow, then you already know what that notebook felt like. Stay with her. The roll call is coming. And if this story has its hooks in you already, take 1 second, subscribe to Honor Tales, and come back for what that colonel does next. Because he is not finished, and neither is she. On Friday, the sabotage stopped being social and became structural, which is to say it acquired page numbers. The read ahead went to print at 0530. 40 binders, 412 pages each, tabbed and sealed for the Secretary of Defense decision. Brief now set for 900, July 15th. NXR was not in it. NXR risk, weather, and abort criteria had been the longest single document in the plan. 31 pages of hard-edged conditions written in a voice that did not negotiate. No launch outside the seasonal weather window. And sheets. No timeline compression without the author's countersignature. Abort authority pushed down to the ground force commander, non-revocable from the rear. In its place sat a single page. Risk assessment moderate mitigated. The author block read prepared by Thielv Hose. 31 pages had become 4 words, and the 4 words were a lie with good posture. What the print shop could not know was what those 31 pages weighed. NXR had been the plan's spine and its conscience. 17 numbered abort criteria, each traceable to a casualty. Report, somewhere in 2 decades of classified after-action reviews. A Weathergate built from 9 years of seasonal data. Authorities pushed forward to the men who would actually be standing in the dust. Documents like that are written the way sea walls are built by people who have seen the water come in. The single page that replaced it had been written by a man planning a conference. At 0640, Voss hit the turnstile, and the turnstile hit back. The badge reader flashed red twice with the small electronic insolence of machinery executing someone else's spite. Escort required. The guard was apologetic. The system was the system. She stood in the visitor pen for 11 minutes while an escort was located, and she used the time to note aloud gently that the visitor control regulation, she cited it by number, paragraph, and letter, required flag concrete in sheets, required flag annotation of any access change within 1 duty day, and that the guard might mention to his supervisor that the annotation was missing. She thanked him by the name on his tape. Dees, the guard, who had been condescended to by 400 important people that year, would remember her for months. Upstairs, Hose moved the war left. He stood at the timeline board in front of the assembled shops and slid the launch window 2 days earlier to fit. Though he did not phrase it this way, the commanders' conference that 3 visiting flag officers needed to make. Compression is a forcing function, he told the room, tapping the board. Moderate risk mitigated, that's the brief. The phrase landed on the floor like something dropped from height. F.A. Weather, NCO, in the back row, opened his mouth, looked at the captain, who had been publicly relanded on Thursday, and closed it. Boone stood at the back wall and felt something he had not felt in years. The specific cold of watching a shape repeat. He had been in theater in 2017. He did not know this woman in the anti-room, had never seen her before Tuesday. The heat came off the concrete and sheets, but he knew what a compressed launch window looked like on a timeline board. And he knew that somewhere in the building's bones, this exact diagram had killed people once, because diagrams like it always had. He had carried a folded Mori sheet. He had carried a folded memorial program in his ruck for a year, in 2017 for a ranger buddy from a different task force whose timeline had been squeezed by a planning cell 11 time zones from the objective. He had not off the concrete and sheets. He had not thought about that program in years. He thought about it now, standing at the back wall, watching a colonel tap a board, and the coffee in his hand went cold, without his noticing. Through the glass, Voss read the board at distance, upside down to half the annotations, and for the first time in 4 days, her pen stopped moving. She sat still for 1 full minute. Then she took out a phone, a government device, sterile as the bag, and made a single call. And the 4 people who half heard it through the anteroom door would each misquote it later because it made no sense to any of them. "No," she said. "Let it run." The secretary reads the roll. She ended the call, squared the notebook to the table edge, and resumed writing. On the main floor, the print shop stacked the last sealed binder onto the cart. The cover page faced the ceiling, and it read in letters that didn't know what they were carrying. Decision, brief, Secretary of Defense, 0900, July 15th. Sand. Command. Sergeant Major Boone had survived 34 years by knowing exactly which regulations he was willing to bend, and never being confused about the difference between curiosity and duty. Friday night, at 22:30, he decided this was duty and pulled the access logs himself. The skiff, the concrete in sheets, the skiff admin cell was empty except for a staff sergeant on shift who knew better than to ask the command sergeant major why he wanted terminal audit records. Boone ran the roster history for the week and read it standing up. Entry deleted. Wednesday 22/111, Terminal J5, actual J5, actual. Actual at the Chief of Plan's own terminal. Not a clerk, not a glitch. The colonel had sat at his own 200 and personally erased. Raced a woman from the building, printed the page, folded it in 3rd Z, and put it in his breast pocket, where it sat against his chest with a specific weight of paper that has become evidence. Space. Then came off the concrete in sheets. Then he went looking for hose off the record, because 34 years had also taught him that you offer a man the ladder before you watch him fall. He found him at the motor court at 0615 Saturday, coffee in hand, rehearsing the brief in his head. You could see the slide transitions moving behind his eyes. The morning was already warm. Sir, a minute off the record. Sergeant Major, expansive. The brief was in 3 hours. Boone did not touch the pocket with the paper in it. Not yet. The visitor in the anteroom, he said. Whoever she is, she reads like the far side of a career you and I never had. She caught a Winseloft error from 20 feet upside down. She cites visitor control regulation from memory by paragraph. She checks a clock like it's a net call. Sir, if she is who I think she is, you want to fix this yourself. Tonight was 4 days ago. You want to fix it this morning? Ha, smiled the smile that. This had gotten him through 29 years and 2 passed over promotion boards without ever once landing on the lesson. She's a staffer, Sergeant Major. Washington sends them in pairs. If she were anybody, she'd have said so by now. He tipped his coffee in a small toast. I appreciate the instinct. Keep the floor tight today. That, Boone thought, is exactly backward. And he could not have said how he knew. Only that 4 days of stillness in that anti-room had the quality of a weapons system in standby, and that people who are anybody never have to say so. The saying is done for them at the worst possible moment by someone whose voice cannot be argued with. At 2100 that night, the last night, it was Boone who carried the coffee into the anteroom. Black, he sat it down without a word, because he had no question he was entitled to ask. Voss looked at the cup, then at him, and answered the question he had not asked. You keep a clean floor, Sergeant Major, she said. Not a pleasantry, his exact duty position, named unprompted by a visitor who had never been introduced to him, in the tone of an evaluation being entered into a record. He stood there a moment. Ma'am, he said finally, and left and did not look anything up because he had no need. The folded page in his pocket had gotten heavier, and he intended to let it choose its own moment. Who was she, that a 34-year command sergeant major went quiet around her, that Wine's aloft table surrendered to her from across a room, that a deleted roster entry and a stolen annex were being allowed by her to run? What kind of person watches the trap being built around her own work and says, "Let it run"? If that question has its hooks in you, this is the moment to subscribe to Honor Tales, because the answer walks into that war room in 2 parts time wearing a charcoal suit, and the roll call it walks in on is one the colonel will hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Her billet room was on the far side of the compound, a visiting officer quarters with a bed, a desk, and a window unit that hummed 1/2 tone flat. Sunday night, 2140. On the nightstand, beside the green notebook, lay a worn tan wrist strap, the woven kind, its edges furred soft with 9 years of handling. It was the only object in the room that was not squared to an edge. She was not, of course, a strategy analyst. Brigadier General Adrian Voss, 47 years old. Director of a compartmented joint planning cell at United States Special Operations Command, commissioned in 2001. 2 combat deployments as a captain, a targeting officer for a Joint Special Operations Task Force at 31, a major writing strike packages at 33, a lieutenant colonel running an operations directorate in theater at 36, and in 2017 at 38, 8, mission commander of an objective called Ridgeline, which existed now in exactly 2 places, a classified archive and her. This is what she carried, and what the room 3 buildings away had spent 5 days filing under furniture. The window had been hers, 72 hours, gated on seasonal weather, dust probability under 15%. Then a conference schedule at a higher headquarters had needed the objective taken earlier, 31 hours earlier, and the order had come down to compress, and she had objected, in writing in an annex in language that did not negotiate. She still knew the memo's paragraph numbers. She had been ordered to launch anyway. The dust arrived on schedule. Her schedule, the one in the objection memo, the one nobody above her had read past the summary line. Visibility fell to 800 meter on exfil, then to 400, and a helicopter that should never have been flying that night, browned out 60 feet above the landing zone. Sergeant First Class. Cole Maddox was 34 years old, an engineer with hands like bench vises, and a laugh that arrived a half-second early, and he put 4 men onto that aircraft in 0 visibility before the rotor wash took the world away. And he did not come home on it. Every other man did. She had signed the inventory of his kit herself at a folding table at 300. In handwriting she did not recognize as her own. The wrist strap had been his. His wife had pressed it into Voss's hand at the memorial and closed her fingers over it and said nothing. Because there was nothing, and there still was not. For the first year, the strap, the concrete in sheets. The strap lived in her pocket where her thumb could find it during meetings in which men explained risk to her in the abstract. In the second year, it moved to the drafting desk in the vault, laid flat above the keyboard, below the monitor, in the sight line deliberately, the way range safety posts the last accident where the new shooters check their targets. It had never once been worn, came off the concrete and sheets. Wearing it was a verdict she had not been ready to sign, because wearing it meant the account was settled, and for 9 years the account had stayed open. What does a person do with a thing like that? Some drink, some transfer, some spend it on ceremony, wreaths, and speeches, and the anesthesia of remembrance. Adrian Voss went to a war college, and then into a vault, and spent 5 years writing a plan in which 2017 was structurally impossible. Operation Stone Meridian, the same strategic problem, solved correctly at scale and stitched through its risk annex, load-bearing non-negotiable. No launch outside the weather windows. No launch outside the weather window. No compression without the author's counter-signature. Abort authority forward. Non-revocable from the rear. 31 pages. Cole Maddox translated into policy. The cell that built it was 11 people behind a vault door with no unit patch and a phone number that did not appear in any directory. 5 years, 491 drafts of the base plan, 2 full-scale tabletop rehearsals a year. She had personally red-teamed her own annex 6 times, hiring the smartest skeptics she could clear, and paying them in the only currency planners respect, which is being taken seriously. The plan had survived every one of them. It had not been designed to survive a colonel with a slide founder and a conference to make because she had believed wrongly. She and Sheets. She now understood that the signature page would protect it. She had not come to this headquarters to be recognized. The heat came off the concrete in Sheets. She had come because the plan was about to leave her hands and become the property of people like the man who had spent this week signing his name to it, and she had wanted to watch it happen at ground level, anonymously. The way you watch a bridge take its first full load. Then Hose had slid the window left. 2 days the same shape, the identical exact shape. The phone buzzed at 21:55. Her deputy back at the cell, voice tight. The red ahead had posted to the classified portal. Annex R was gone. The timeline showed compression. Did she want the cell to flag it to the Joint Staff tonight? Voss looked at the wrist strap on the nightstand. Here is what her deputy could not see, and what the audience now can. The decision brief protocol for a Secretary of Defense is not folklore. It is written. The Secretary's advanced team publishes the format, and the format has 2 lines. And the second line, the one staff officer skim has been the second line for 3 administrations. Roll call. Then author briefs, the author by name, not the host, not the chief of plans, not whoever's name sits on the footer of a stolen slide. The room had built a trap for her all week. It had never once occurred to the room that she might simply stop preventing it from springing the other way. No, she said. Let it run. The secretary reads the roll. She set the phone down. She placed the wrist strap beside the notebook and aligned them square to the desk edge. The straps frayed in just touching the notebook's spine, the way a pin just touches a grenade. Lights out at 2200 exactly. Monday 0730, 90 minutes to the secretary. The murder board was the last rehearsal, and Hose conducted it like an opening night. The war room was full, 40 principals and their seconds, the visiting flag officers in the front row. Lieutenant General Samuel Ostrander, the task force commander, silver-haired and watchful, at the head, Hose walked the room through the operation with genuine skill. The man could brief whatever else was true of him. And then he arrived at the risk architecture, his risk architecture, and put the slide up, and the footer said, prepared by Colveos in 11 Loint type. The heat came off the concrete in sheets that Adrian Voss could read through a glass wall from 60 feet, because she had written the original at that exact font size, and because she had written every word above the footer, too. This annex is 3 weeks of my life, people, Hose said, resting his hand on the podium. Treat it that way. 3 weeks. She had a 5-year callus on her right middle finger from the drafting of it. In the anteroom, something happened. That Brooks, hovering near the glass, with binders she no longer needed to carry, would describe to investigators, if there had ever been investigators, as the most unsettling thing she saw all week. The woman in the charcoal suit watched the muted slides advance, and her lips moved slightly half a beat ahead of the screen. Paragraph, numbers, section headers. She was mouthing the annex before Huss reached each line, not following the brief preceding it. Brooks slipped into the anti-room, ashamed of her own floor. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. The feed in here cuts the audio. It's a bandwidth setting. I've asked twice." "It doesn't matter," Captain Voss said. "He's very good at reading." And then she smiled. First time in 6 days. It was a small, exact smile. The smile of a person confirming that a long arithmetic has closed to 0. And Lena Brooks, who did not yet understand a single thing that was about to happen, felt the hair rise on her arms. Anyway, on the floor, the communications section ran the final checks for the secure video teleconference. The secretary's advanced staff pushed the connection protocol at 0800, and it printed out at the comms desk. 2 lines. Standard format, 3 administrations old. Line 1, connection 0900, principal seated 0850. Line 2, roll call, then author briefs. The comm sergeant clipped it to the board. 40 officers walked past it. Not one off the concrete in sheets. Not one of them read the second line, because staff officers have been skimming second lines since the invention of the second line, and because every person on that floor believed the author was already standing at the podium, rehearsing. Resting his hand on the wood, one man read it twice. Boone stood at the board for a long moment and touched the folded page in his breast pocket and looked down the floor at the glass. Room where the visitor in the charcoal suit had stood up from her chair 0855, exactly, buttoned her jacket, and taken one step toward the door. Not pacing, positioned a woman standing where she could be found quickly. The heat came off the concrete in sheets, the way you stand when you have an appointment that the other party does not yet know they have. The command so concrete in sheets. The command sergeant major did not smile because the moment was too large for it, but he moved on instinct 3 steps closer to the anteroom door, the watcher taking his post at the exact hinge of the story, and the wall clock swept up on 0900, and the screen at the head of the war room went from black to blue, to a seal, and every conversation on the floor died mid-syllable. The Secretary of Defense appeared on the main display at 091 seconds, seated in front of a flag, reading glasses low, a single sheet of paper in his hand. Warren Holt had been a rifle platoon leader before he had been anything else. And 40 years of rooms like sheets and 40 years of rooms like this one had left him that his staff called the pause, and the Pentagon called more honestly the weigh-in. He read the roll of every decision brief name by name before a single slide moved. People who prepare rooms for a living learn to fear a man who reads the manifest. "Good morning," Holt said. Before we begin, he looked down at the sheet. General Estrander, Deputy Commander, J2, J3. He worked down the column and the room answered, each principal nodding into the camera in turn, and it went like a metronome until it did not. Holt stopped. He looked at the sheet. He mopped the concrete sheets. He looked over his glasses at the room, and something in the camera's geometry made it feel as if he were looking at each of the 40 people individually. "I don't see the author on my roll." The Secretary of Defense said, "Where is General Voss?" The silence that followed had a shape, and the shape was the concrete in sheets, and the shape was 40 people not moving while their understanding of the last 6 days reorganized itself at speed. Hose was standing at the podium with his hand on the wood. What crossed his face crossed it in 4 distinct stations, and Boone, 3 steps from the anti-room door, watching the man instead of the screen, would remember each one. Confusion first, honest confusion. Sir, the plan is J5's product. I'm prepared to then disbelief as his eyes drop to his own roster, his groomed roster, the one with no anomalies, and found the name his own terminal had deleted at Wednesday 22-111. Then recognition arriving like ice water finding the spine, the Winseloff table, the regulation cited by paragraph, the badge worn inward, the clock checked in 5-minute intervals by a woman timing a building, and then the fourth station, the one the other 39 people in the room could see from behind in the set of his shoulders. Horror, Colonel. Holt said, not unkindly, which made it worse. I'm not hearing Stone Meridian from anyone but the officer who wrote it. We'll wait. We'll wait. 2 words from the civilian control of the United States military, and the room learned what those words do to time. Nobody instructed anyone. The room simply resorted, the way iron filings resort around a magnet. The visiting flag officers straightening Ostrander's head, turning with a slow, terrible calm toward his chief of plans. 40 pairs of eyes performing the same triangulation. The empty second chair at the far end, the glass anteroom, him off the concrete in sheets, the woman in the charcoal suit standing behind it with her jacket buttoned. There was no formation. Nobody called the room to attention. No call sign cracked across a net. The building did something quieter and much larger. It waited on the record, in front of the Secretary of Defense, for the note-taker. Brooks would try afterward to describe the walk to big people who had not been there and would always land on the same detail, the sound. There wasn't any. Heat came off the concrete in sheets. 300 people on a briefing floor, and the only audio was the air handling and one set of footsteps in the corridor as the chief of plans went to fetch the woman he had evicted, and the footsteps sounded. She swore exactly like a metronome that someone else had set. And it was Hose who had to go get her. Protocol offered no alternative, and mercy no exit. The briefer walks, the room watches. Victor Hose crossed his own floor, 40 meters, the longest of his 29 years. Lit the coffet. Past the coffee mess where the nickname had been coined, past the comms board with its 2-line protocol he had never read, and opened the anteroom door. General, he said, and his voice performed its final demotion from broadcast to whisper. They're ready for you. Adrian Vosos looked at him for exactly 1 level second, the surveyor's second, the grading of a slope, and answered in a voice that carried no further than the doorway, and would nonetheless be quoted in that building for years. They were always ready, Colonel. They just weren't looking. She walked the 40-meter back at her even pace, heel to toe, 60 seconds by the wall clock. In a silence you could stand a rifle in, Boone came to attention as she passed him, alone, unbidden, unordered. One soldier's spine executing its own private finding of fact, and no one else moved, and that was correct, because this had never been a story about a room saluting. She took the podium. She squared her notebook to its edge. Mr. Secretary, Brigadier General Adrian Vosos. Stone Meridian is a 72-hour operation, gated on the seasonal weather window. And, before I take you through it, 2 corrections for the record. The window on the board has been moved, 31 hours left of survivable. It moves back this morning, and the read-ahead's risk page is not mine. The author's annex is 31 pages. It is non-negotiable, and it is the reason this plan works. Holt's eyes went on the screen to the podium slide fodder, then to somewhere off-camera, where an aide was already handing him something. Colonel Hose, the secretary said, mild as a scalpel. Why does my read-ahead say, moderate, mitigated where the author wrote a hard stop? The question hung in the room's air conditioning for 3 full seconds. On the screen, Warren Hull took off his reading glasses with the unhurried economy of a man who had chaired 1,000 meetings and ended careers in maybe 30 of them, always in this same register. In the front row, one of the visiting flag officers looked down at his own copy of the read ahead as if it had become evidence, which it had. Haas opened his mouth. What came out, sir? The risk framework was consolidated for readability, was 11 words long, and the room heard all 412 pages of what it was not. Teetseet, and in the pause that followed, in front of 40 witnesses and the civilian control of the United States military, Command Sergeant Major Arland Boone stepped forward and put a folded page, printed at 22:30 on a Friday night, into the hand of Lieutenant General Samuel Orstander. The brief itself took 51 minutes, and people who were in the room say it was the cleanest they ever heard. Heard. Exact figures, no adjectives, a weather window restored in one sentence, and a counter-signature rule stated as standing policy. The secretary asked 11 questions. She answered 10 from memory, and the 11th by citing the annex's own paragraph number, and Holt's mouth moved at that briefly, in something adjacent to a smile. When the screen finally dropped to black, his last line stayed behind in the room like a posted order. General Voss, the window is yours. Nobody moves it again. What happened afterward happened fast-assed and quietly and entirely on paper, which is to say in the only language the building fully believed. Ostander's office, 1100. The folded printout lay flat on the desk between the task force commander and his chief of plans. Its crease pressed out, its single line read aloud once. Entry deleted. Wednesday 22/11, Terminal J5 Actual. Haas stood at attention and did not attempt the roster grooming and defense he had rehearsed in the corridor because Ostrander's face had a weather advisory posted on it. Deletion from your terminal, Victor. Your annex theft is on a slide footer in the Secretary of Defense's read ahead. Give me one reason this doesn't go to the Inspector General. The reason came from the doorway in a level voice. Because I need a chief of plans who has already learned this lesson. General, said Adrian Voss, he starts tomorrow under me. Both men looked at her. Maffed. She came in and set the green notebook on the desk unopened. 6 days of timestamps that everyone present understood. She would never need to show anyone. Stone Meridian executes out of this headquarters in 90 days, she said. I can spend those days breaking in a new plans chief. Or I can have the one man in this building who now understands at the cellular level why the annex is non-negotiable. He knows the plan cold. He spent 3 weeks memorizing it. I intend to make that useful. A beat. The stolen authorship is between him and his own ceiling. Came off the concrete in sheets. The window is between him and me. It will not move again. If you have ever wondered what winning looks like when nobody gets dragged out of a building, there's no handcuffs, no formation, no gavel, just a Colonel Kernus, who wakes up tomorrow inside the org chart of the woman he called Sweetie, executing her annex under her counter-signature for as long as she finds him useful. Some verdicts are served in courtrooms. The quiet ones are served at 0730, daily in perpetuity. If this story found something in you, take a breath. Take a breath while she signs the order and subscribe to Honor Tales, because there is always another room that hasn't learned to read the roll. Whom Hans came to her that afternoon in the war room where a captain was placing a new placard at the head of the table. He stood for a moment in front of the woman he had walked out of this room 6 days earlier and produced the only 3 syllables he owed. Ma'am, my apologies. Earn the annex, Colonel, Voss said. And that was the entire conversation, and both of them understood it was also the terms of his parole. He would earn it, as it turned out. People who watched the next 90 days reported that the chief of plans had become a different instrument. Queter, precise first into the weather data every morning. A man executing another officer's plan with the studied care of someone who understands exactly how it is scored and exactly who is scoring it. Redemption in an institution rarely announces itself. It just shows up early and stops signing its name to things. The rest settled, the way water settles. Captain Lena Brooks was reassigned by name to the Stone Meridian Planning Cell. The request signed by Voss personally with an online justification that Brooks would frame badly years later as a joke and keep anyway. Rallybait's rosters. Believes printouts. The weather NCO, who had almost spoken up, got a closed door with the command sergeant major about the cost of almost, and Boone himself got no ceremony at all, which was the only reward he would have accepted. He got 4 words instead from the general in passing at the door. "You were right on Tuesday, Sergeant Major." He had never told her what he thought on Tuesday. He stood there a moment, did the math on badge logs and clock checks, and a woman who timed a building gave it up and went back to keeping a clean floor. She flew home commercial that evening. Seat 14C, aisle, aft of the wing, charcoal suit, sterile bag, a green notebook squared to the tray table's edge, and on her wrist now, for the first time in 9 years, worn instead of carried, a frayed tan strap that had once belonged to Sergeant First Class Cole Maddox, Engineer 34, who put 4 men on a helicopter in the dust and did not come home on it, and whose name now lived load-bearing and non-negotiable inside 31 pages that no colonel, no conference, and no clock would ever move again. The seatbelt sign chimed. Nobody on the aircraft looked at her twice. She preferred it that way. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for